Good afternoon. Oh, that's great. It's lovely to see all of you. Thank you so much for coming out on this rainy Wednesday. Bruce Chadbourne, who is a resident down in the woods with his lovely Linda, as I call her, Bruce's wife, have been residents here at Cornwall Manor for about 6 years. And Bruce and Linda are both very involved on campus in many different facets. And Bruce is also a volunteer across the street at the Cornwall Iron Furnace. So I'll let him tell you a little bit more about how he got involved in the history. Of course, he wrote the Anne of Cornwall book about Anne Coleman. No. The first book, the Anne of Cornwall. Anne Coleman Rogers. All right, pay attention because I think he's 20. Lovely Linda has it correct. 20 Anns, 20 Roberts. The Coleman family is a very large tree. But anyways, so Bruce is involved over at the Cornwall Iron Furnace. He does a lot of history for them and tours. So actually the history of the Cornwall Iron Furnace and Cornwall Manor is one of the reasons that brought the Chadbournes to Cornwall Manor. So we're very grateful to have both of them living here and very immersed in our community. So Bruce is doing this kind of as a multi-purpose. Of course, the books are being sold in the Manor Shop and proceeds do benefit benevolent care. So thank you on behalf of the Society. And then Sherry and I also had asked Bruce to do this in honor of Cornwall Manor's 75th anniversary this year. So thank you from the anniversary committee as well. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Bruce, and thank you so much for sharing this program with us.
Well, thank you, everyone. And boy, I really am grateful to see so many here. Is this getting out okay, the sound? Okay. The title, you see, says surveying in quotes because as I kept pulling the string, there was more and more things I thought I might say today, and so it quickly becomes one of those 30,000-foot kind of presentations and a rapid survey of local history. And I hope that's okay. It could stimulate a lot of questions. If you need a quick clarification, it's okay if you call that out, but otherwise we'll try to wait till the end. And hopefully I'll answer every possible question here. Does anybody know where that house was in Cornwall? That's the teaser. Okay, well that's kind of what intrigued me is, well, first of all, as Stacia said, the first day we visited here, it was like January 6 years ago, and we saw the beautiful campus here at Cornwall Manor, but also saw this interesting building across the street. And given my engineering background, I really wanted to know more about that. In fact, I think that first day, went over there and introduced ourselves to the lady in the gift shop, and said, we might be coming here and I might want to give tours here. And she said, she hands me a book, says, read this. And so when we came back that August, I went back and the rest is history, right? So what happened here, of course, is I should give credit. There are a couple that lived here some time ago, John and Marjorie Feitig. If any of you are local people, you might know that name. And I know Jeannie Bolts pulled me aside one time and said, I guess you taught school together with? Yes. And so I intend to get more information from you at a time in the near future. But anyway, their passion was Cornwall history, and also particularly the fourth generation of Colemans involving Robert H. Coleman, because he inherited all the wealth that trickled down through this large family. And there were some tragedies in his life, and that part is written into the second book, Robert Coleman, Florida Man. And he had this penchant, he had a lot of money, so he was building large buildings here and there, and tragedy, part of the tragedy is probably none of them exist today. So, and there's an interesting story behind all of that. including that one. So after the Anne story came out on Lebtown, we were getting ready to do the Robert story, but there was this short thing that popped up involving this mansion, and that's sort of holding the whole story together. So the two main stories that some of you so graciously purchased copies of, and again, thank you on behalf of Cornwall Manor Benevolence for that. But you see Robert Habersham Coleman and his sister Anne, they're in their about 8-year-old stage here on one of the family trips to Paris, and they had their portraits taken in a studio there. And another set of photos about 10 years later as teenagers, and these photos appear in the booklets, and that's what kind of precipitated this whole presentation today. So thank you again if you've purchased one of those. So one of the first questions I often get is, boy, this family tree is awfully complicated, and I'm glad you put that simplified family tree in the booklet, in Anne's booklet. And I thought I'd better come back and say a little bit more about that, just to help you or to confuse you further, and then we'll give you a quiz at the end to see how much you've retained, okay? And you may notice a recurring theme in terms of how many names are repeated across 4 generations here. It starts with Robert Coleman. He's the fellow that came from Ireland. He did not establish the Cornwall furnace, but he sort of like the gold rush or whatever. He just saw great wealth here, and he gradually worked his way into the iron business and ended up dominating it to the point he was considered to be one of America's first millionaires back around the time of the Revolution. And in the process of him getting established, there was a fellow named James Old that he worked for, and so he married the boss's daughter. And so it begins. And starting in 1774, they began having children, one for about every 2 years for the next 25 to 30 years. So, yeah, isn't that something? So we start, and I just want a little popcorn trivia here. The first was Margaret Coleman. And if you know the mansion in Philadelphia, I think it's called Strawberry Manor, Strawberry Mansion. Some said, well, that's where they lived. She married Joseph Hemphill, who was a politician and became a judge in Philadelphia. And they didn't build that mansion, but they purchased it. And she comes up at the end of the slide here as part of the story. William Coleman. What you're going to see here are 4 primary sons who inherit the next generation of the business, and William was one of them, and ultimately he was the one that owned and worked out of our local Cornwall, probably lived in the mansion, and I'm a little fuzzy on some of those facts, and I always want to go ask Henry Deemer to straighten me out on that. His brother James Coleman married Harriet Dawson. Their first, and I'm going to show you pictures of these things, he owned the Elizabeth furnace. And then his son George Dawson is the one that established all of those mansions and the furnaces in North Lebanon. Some of you know about Coleman Memorial Park up there, right? So that's that branch of the family. Thomas Bird Coleman, the local one here in Cornwall, he married Hannah Cassatt, and if any artists in the room, it's Mary Cassatt, right? That's part of that. She's quite a famous artist and of that line. And you can, I'll mention the Colebrook furnace in a few more minutes. Edward, another son. I don't think I have any really interesting facts to mention about him. And then there's these 2 sisters that you might have heard the legends about. Anne, here's one of the first Annes, other than Mother Anne Carolyn Coleman. She's the one that was betrothed to James Buchanan, our president, the bachelor president. And I don't want to tell you the whole story there, but basically their relationship became strained, and she went back to Philadelphia to stay with her sister Margaret, who frankly is old enough to be her mother, by the way. But she went to kind of to hide out back in Philadelphia because of the strain with James, and she died there under mysterious circumstances, apparently involving an overdose. So, and then her sister Sarah Hand Coleman, her relationship was with Reverend Muhlenberg down in Lancaster, and Father Robert Coleman was not happy about that relationship, and that one too ended in a tragic death. So, and then there were 7 others, too numerous to mention. I think that adds up to 14, Jim. Did you get it? Okay, sometimes we're known to make errors, and that's where I have to confess there's a typo. If you bought the Robert Coleman Florida Man book, page 6, I gotta fess up here, right? It says our hero Robert H. Coleman was born in 1956, which just missed it by 100 years. So your copy might show a little pen correction there, and if it didn't, I apologize, and I will personally correct it for you. So, all right, so the 4 arrows point to the 4 main sons. They kind of inherit the family iron business because Robert Sr. retires in 1809 and continues to live out his days down in King Street in Lancaster, and they become the active day-to-day guys there. Boy, we're going way too slow. So Thomas Bird now is where we're going to focus the story. Here's the local Cornwall focus of the story, and these are going to list all of their children because they're are not quite nearly as many. There's another Anne. This would be Aunt Anne or Auntie Annie to our heroes. And she had married Bradford Allen of the Mayflower line, and they built the Millwood Mansion, or the Alden Mansion, that still stands today over on the hill west of here, above Alden Place in Northgate. So, Margaret Cassatt Coleman, there's that middle name. She married William Freeman, and they're the ones that initially, well, after Thomas Bird, they inhabited the local mansion, which was, of course, a summer cottage because they lived down in Washington, D.C. Give you a picture of their house. And one of their daughters is Margaret Coleman Freeman Buckingham, who ultimately almost donated the property here to what became the Methodist Church home. Sarah Hand Coleman, you saw that name already, but she's the younger, and she's known, her memory is preserved here because of our greenhouse. You can see her name on the plaque there. 2 sons, Robert, or sometimes known as R.W. Coleman, and not 2 sons, Robert, and his another sister, Isabella. And then the last son, William Coleman, who becomes the father of our heroes. Now, he married Susan Ellen, or Sue Ellen Habersham, because he went down to Savannah, Georgia. This was prior to the Civil War. They have cotton, we have iron, and they figured out establishing trade well beyond our normal boundaries was a good thing. So, and he met Sue Ellen and married there. So, I had to pause here. One other question that usually comes up, somebody tells me I misspelled bird in the book, and I say, oh no, it's not true. There are 2 different birds locally here, and I explain that here. As you might remember on the previous slide, Thomas Bird Coleman is correctly spelled, and 3rd bullet there, it says, there were these Bird fellows, William and Mark. They were iron masters and built the Hopewell Furnace, which is over southeast of Reading, and a town called Birdsboro. And I'm going to prevail on Sherry 2 things. First of all, we said we were going to have a tour of the local furnace sometime, because a lot of you got those free tickets when you became residents, and you still haven't used them, right? So we'll make that available. But I wonder if Sherry would also be willing to organize a trip over to Hopewell Furnace sometime, because that is a recreated and in some ways exceeds what we have here, although it is a rebuilt kind of. Was that a yes, you'll do that, Sherry? Okay. No pressure. All right, but the other Bird, B-U-R-D, is where we get the name of the road in the village, Bird Coleman. In fact, on Bird Coleman Road, as you drive into the woods, there used to be a very large industrial furnace built around 1870 that lasted for about 40 years or so. And most of us are grateful that it's no longer there, right? But quite a lot of industrial activity right in our backyard, literally. So, and it says also that name came from a Colonel James Bird, who was father-in-law of Peter Grubb, who was the fellow that initially established our furnace. Okay, so Robert Coleman, the original one, had business dealings presumably with both of these, and that's why the name assimilated into the family. So that's my working theory. All right, so Robert Coleman, his first foray into the business here was he started acquiring a share in the Elizabeth Furnace. Now, this is just over east of here in Brickerville. Is your mind swimming with too many facts already? Okay. You know Brickerville, 501 goes north over the turnpike, and immediately there on the right is the Elizabeth Furnace. Actually, to the south of the turnpike on the left is the Coleman Memorial Chapel and an old barn. And by the way, they're having a 150th anniversary later this year with some activities that you might want to partake in. But that's the mansion they lived in. And that picture was taken just a couple of weeks ago when I was over there. That is the Coleman addition to the mansion. The original is the little wing on the right side. I don't know if I dare. You can kind of see it behind the tree there. It was actually the first owner of this was a fellow named Huber, and then he built the furnace, was a lousy iron master, and within a few years sold it to Stiegel, Baron Stiegel, who's known for Mannheim and the glass making. And Stiegel wasn't that great of a businessman as far as iron either. He went bankrupt and was in debtor's prison by 1770. And that's when Robert Coleman started purchasing. First he leased the furnace, and then he almost immediately started buying shares and ultimately bought out the furnace. And the furnace is an interesting story. This too, taken a couple of weeks ago. If our Cornwall furnace across the street had not been well preserved, this is what it would look like today. That's one of the walls of the old Elizabeth furnace. It had been completely plowed over with old dirt and charcoal. And 20 years ago, a couple of guys decided it would be fun to start digging it out. And see that little white bucket here? They were basically emptying it. I've got a pointer here, but it doesn't. You can point at it if it works there. Well, it doesn't show up on the screen. Well, maybe you see that tiny little dot. That's much better. No, you're good. I'm going to call on you a few more times. If you can imagine, well, you can't appreciate from this picture, but there's a lot of dirt that's been moved, and a lot of it just by those tiny little plastic buckets, because they wanted to make sure they did not miss any artifacts. But last year, they finally got a little skid loader to pull out a lot of the dirt, and that's when that big wall got exposed, and things have been moving along. And this other picture is looking right at the face of the furnace, which is kind of hard to distinguish possibly, so that's the opening that you were pointing at. That's where the iron comes out, but I made it, if that helps, you get the wings coming out from the furnace, the structure that supports it. So most of the furnace got pushed over, so only like the top 6 feet or so still stand, but it might be cool to rebuild that someday. I don't know. All right, well, that's the Elizabeth story in a nutshell. West of here, over in Colebrook, if you like Mount Gretna and just keep going a few more miles, you end up over on Route 241 in Colebrook, and where 117 and 241 meet or split, depending how you look at it, there's the old mansion there. This is Thomas Bird Coleman's mansion. He built the furnace. I had a date here, but I'm starting to lose dates in my head already. 1790. I think you're right. And very good, by the way. And that's what it looks like today, thanks to Google. You don't even have to go over there. You can just look at this online now. And a private family lives in there. Now, across the street, we've had the opportunity to meet the lady that owns this farm. It looks like a farm anyway. You want to shine on the big white barn there. That's actually the charcoal barn for the old furnace, just like we have a big charcoal barn across the street here. And over on the right, where I have a little rectangle saying furnace, that's where the actual stack stood. Now, it is a farm now. The time I went over there, where there were cows wandering around below the barn there, and we had a great conversation, but they couldn't tell me anything about the furnace that stood there. In fact, here's where you would stand. It almost looks like it's still smoking there in the middle, but the furnace stack was just about there, downhill from the charcoal barn. And that's what the barn looks like today. And if you superimposed a furnace, it's kind of hard to make out. Did you? So if you go over there, I understand, what did they open, a new ice cream shop or something?
A new tavern.
The tavern?
On the stream.
Yeah, on the other side of the stream from this. So you could go over there now and just gaze with appreciation for what used to be here. So, okay, it's time to get back to the original story. You've had the survey, you've got Elizabeth, you've got Colebrook. Back to Cornwall. When I look at pictures like this, I still just get amazed that such nice buildings were right here, right down the hill from where we're sitting now, and unfortunately they no longer exist. This is the so-called cottage, just like our Buckingham Mansion was considered a cottage. This is where the William and Sue Ellen Coleman people lived. Now, they had a house in New York City, and they traveled to Paris. They'd go down to Savannah because her family was down there. But when they came back to Cornwall in the fair weather days, this is where they stayed. Beautiful house. You actually see a couple of ladies sitting on the front veranda there. And let's see. Anne was born here. Robert was born down in Savannah. But that's just another view. You turn the house sideways just to get more of a sense of the structure of that. So. And I thought I'd also take you down to Savannah really quickly. Linda and I, when we lived in Florida, prior to coming here, one of the times we got to come to visit Savannah, and it was really a delightful visit in Old Town Savannah. Anybody been there? It's a planned city, a grid. You know, every few blocks is another green or a square, and around the square were the different homes. So in Orleans Square is the Bullock Mansion. That's where Robert was born. And the pink house on the right here, this goes way back to the original Habershams. I'm going to get the name wrong if I don't look. James Habersham, the first. He was the fellow that came over with George Whitefield as an evangelist. Probably knew John Wesley. Wesley had been there just a couple years prior, and that's how he got himself established in Georgia. Eventually, he became governor of the colony and all, and that was the house. It's now some kind of a tavern restaurant. A friend from the Furnace was just down there a couple weeks ago and didn't give me that picture, but told me it's still there and they're still quite interested in the whole Habersham story. So Sherry, could we go to Savannah? Got a lot of people. And before we get back to Cornwall again, remember the Freemans, they lived in Washington. This is their house. The Ashburton House was the first built for British diplomats. There were some negotiations going on regarding the borders with Canada. This is, I'm not sure I got it's early 1800s. But mid-1800s, about 1850, the Freemans took possession of the house. And one interesting fact about this is right across Lafayette Square from the White House, and now is part of the Episcopal Church that stands next to it. And one of the things, one of the fanciful thoughts I have is that the young Freeman boys, try to imagine them playing in the park with the Lincoln boys. You know, it's the same years, could have happened, we don't know for sure, but just a little interesting family time. So now, so as the story progresses, young Robert H. Coleman has made his way through boarding school and then Trinity College. And in 1877, he reaches age 21 and he's reached what they called majority, which means he's old enough now to inherit all of the wealth that's been parked in his bank account and guarded by a fellow named Samuel Small. We had a conversation back there. Samuel Small of York, Pennsylvania. He was Robert's guardian. So things start, the money starts flowing in 1877. And one of the things he and his mother, by the way, Father William has died by this point. He died in 1864, but his mother's tried to hold him back, rein in the urge to spend, but finally they say, well, let's put that wing on the cottage that we've been talking about. So that's what it looks like now. I'm going to go, this really would be helpful. Robert Coleman, Robert H., the young fellow, loved playing the organ and was fascinated with mechanical things. So this is a water-driven pump organ. Down in the basement is some kind of water mechanisms that create the air pressure to play the organ. Right down there, I'm going to have a map later, I'll point kind of an aerial view, but right there on the grounds, basically there's a sports field there now. Might be the end zone for one of the ends of the ball field. So. It doesn't stand today. It's gone, unfortunately. Now, that was 1877. In a period of 10 years, a whole bunch of things have happened. He's in his second marriage now. And you notice what's creeping up behind the original cottage. That is the second bridal mansion. Okay, and we'll get back to the first. But that's what it looks like from the front. You can see the original cottage there, and parts of the extension are still visible out back, but somehow the architects, Bob Beers is going to tell us how this was done, I suppose, but they put up, it's more than just a facade. They put a whole new huge building in the front of and that stood till about 1914. And unfortunately, they said, tear it down. And it's a shame, but when you're driving through, the deadly corners down by the police station and start heading up Cornwall Road, on your left, this is what you would see. And it's an empty field now. Okay, in fact, as you're driving up Cornwall Road, looking out your left, there would be the driveway. You can see the big mansion in there behind the trees, and on the left is the organ conservatory building. Such a shame. That's the only, I've run out of words to explain how, it's a tragedy that it's not there. Barry?
Is that right behind where that stone wall,
Yeah.
masonry wall still exists?
Yeah. In fact, some of the records, the Feidigs did such exhaustive research. We even have the specifications and the purchase order for the stones for that wall. I mean, there's just so much material they collected. Basically, for the last 5 years, I've been reading all of these bits of information, and that's why some of these stories have been popping out. It's just, like the one about the National Guard riot and the B.F. Heen, the assistant to Coleman. There's just a mountain of material that they put together. And one of the other tragedies is the Feidigs never published the book they intended to write about this. So I have a presentation coming up in August where I intend to give an outline of that. So hopefully you'll come back. It'll be one of those Tuesday evening furnace talks in this room. So. And the gates, you mentioned the stone wall, Barry. The gates for that mansion were thankfully not lost. They were relocated over to the PRL entrance just below our furnace. So when you drive out that way, you might notice those gates standing there. That's what adorned the entrance to Robert H. Coleman's mansion. Now, Sister Ann Coleman, 1880, she married and moved with her husband back to his home area in Hyde Park. And it took them a few years to build this, but that's the home they built. You can kind of see some sibling, I don't know if a sibling rivalry or just they were celebrating their wealth together and say, look what I've got, you know. And that's the great Crumwald Hall at Hyde Park. And there's an aerial view, 2 shots. The left one is an old picture. It just kind of gives greater definition that you don't get in that original picture, how much was in that complex, let's call it, just a vast building. And on the right, Google Earth, I used available resources. You can see the Hudson River right up at the top. They had purchased about a mile's worth of property of waterfront, and that's the mansion there. Since then, I think it's called the Millennial Kingdom Church or something owns that, and they've added another structure, but most of that is what the original footprint of the mansion. So, and meanwhile, Robert, when you read the Florida man story, part of his dealings down in Florida, this love of mansions and things, he was going to build this down near St. Augustine. And you get a sense of the ornateness of that. And it was planned architecturally, but as far as we know, a shovel never touched the dirt to begin this, because by 1893, even before that, he was feeling financially strapped. Instead, he started out down there. He had a home in Jacksonville, and it looks a little bit more like something some of us could live in, but on a corner of a street there in Jacksonville. So, and that's where he started raising his family with his second marriage. He also built a great mansion for his own horses here in Cornwall. You might notice this looks a lot like our own Bradley Hall, which was built essentially the same year. So the Freeman line on one side was up on the hill building our stables, and he built one just like it down below. Actually, it was better than this one. I'll speak for him. You know, they had all kinds of interesting glass skylights and so forth. And this is one of the few structures that still stands today. It's actually tucked away in the trees. No kidding. I got snuck in there one day to take a peek. It's got a chain link fence around it to keep rabble-rousers like me out of there. But unfortunately, it's in really poor condition. The borough would like to gain ownership of it, to restore it, but parts of the roof are falling in, and there's been vandalism inside. And as you're driving up Cornwall Road and looking off to your left, back in the trees, you might see the pointed steeple of that, especially in the wintertime before the green comes out. So it's getting a little late to see it, but it's back there. Okay, a few more quick house stories. 1893, Coleman suffers his financial failure. There's a big, really a global financial crisis going on, and that helped pull him down. And he is pulling out of Cornwall and Lebanon, and they end up in Saranac Lake. the last months of residence here, they were in the Anthracite Mansion, which would be over, I'm trying to get where Anthracite is that way. There was a furnace over there, just on the other side of, what's the hill here? Grandview, what's the other street up there? Treetop Circle. If you throw a stone over the back side of the wall there, the hill, Anthracite furnace was back there. And there was a superintendent's mansion that accompanied that, and that also no longer exists. But they moved to Saranac Lake. They were dealing with tuberculosis, and that was the center of tuberculosis treatment. Yeah, I remember, Debbie, you've got some traction with Saranac Lake. And they built this house, and unfortunately, it's one more house that no longer stands. It got acquired by the not Bartholomew, but one of those, a church there. It's a playground now for kids on the hill. And that's Robert H. Coleman, solitary man. His second wife has died, and he's suffered some other tragedies by that point. Well, just for the sake of completeness, you get a reminder that here's a mansion that still stands, thankfully, that we enjoy. This would be with the Freeman and the Buckingham side of the family. And there's a picture of Millwood. Thankfully still stands, and a good friend, Harvey Turner, is busy restoring that back to prime condition. So. And you can call that either the Alden Mansion or Millwood. All right, now, just some of you know about North Lebanon. Wanted to give you a few more pictures here. The James Coleman side of the family and George Dawson Coleman established furnaces in the north side of town and built some exquisite mansions on the hill there where, what is that called? Just called Coleman Memorial Park, right as you go up Route 72. And there was quite a lot up there. The Homestead Mansion, and four more. Brock is one of the married family names that were part of that part of the dynasty. Arthur Brock, Horace Brock, John Penn Brock. Unfortunately, these names haven't meant anything to me yet, if I get a chance to study that. And Bertram Dawson Coleman as well. If you were to get in a hot air balloon here on Cornwall Manor and just go straight up and look down, this is the view you would get of Cornwall Center. So the school is down here, Cornwall Manor is right here, there's the Catholic Church, and there's Cornwall Road. This really is a nice pointer. All right, so there's the sports field, and you can see some scars here. I don't know if those are actually evidence of where the lane was, but you can kind of see, it looks like a road going in there, and there's some square-like depressions over here. So my guess is that's where the cottage stood and the big second mansion that got built. Right across, this is Snitz Creek going down through here, flowing that way. And right across the creek, they had a little bridge, and the stable building is right there, and it's still there. So again, if you're driving up this way and look that way, you might have a good chance of seeing a bit of the silhouette. Now, the story is this big mansion we've been talking about was considered by many to be the bridal mansion, and one of the things the Feidigs were working on was, well, actually there was another mansion that preceded that, because when Robert got married in 1879, he wanted to build his bride an exquisite home, and he didn't want it right next to his mother's house. So they were going out in this direction, and there was some correspondence that talked about don't build it too close to the creek, and maybe go up on the hill here where you get a nice view of things. And according to what the Feidigs were collecting for information, they believe it was right here, and at this moment, today. There's this nice little house that sits there. It looks like almost like a Frank Lloyd Wright house. I forget the name of the family that lives there, but and they had found some stones that were laying around there and believed that that was the location. That was one of the mystique, the ways the Feidigs were enticing the historical community around here. Said, we know where the mansion was, and they would hold a meeting and start talking, and then the meeting would get too long and they never actually reveal their secrets. And apparently that's what was going to be in this book that they intended to write. So, but there were photographs and notes and things about stones they had found over here. So that house had been built partially. Meanwhile, Robert and his wife Lily, his first wife, were off in Europe, and then they were honeymooning down in Georgia, Thomasville, Georgia. And Lily all the time was ailing, and they were back in Europe when she died. And Robert, being so distraught by that, he put a halt to the construction and ordered that the place be torn down. So the stones from that mansion over here, apparently most of them ended up in Lebanon for St. Luke's Episcopal Church, if some of you are familiar with that structure. So that's sort of plants the seeds for the mystery. Now yes. Yes. He's just referring to, as you go out, well, I guess you call it 419, there's a circular racetrack in the woods, and you can see some depressions or berms, or, and with a curve, you can tell where it was. And with the Google satellite, you can see the impressions of it. It's, I think, called the half-mile racetrack, and that was part of, he had a stable here, and apparently they would run horses, and I don't know what kind of surreys or whatever were involved in horse racing at the time. You know?
My dad, who's now would have been like 104 as a kid,
Sulky races? Yeah. So, there's bits of evidence here that are still quite intriguing. And wished it all had survived, right? It would be much more interesting. Okay, so just to wrap up that bridal mansion story, this was the second one. He had two wives, Lily, they married in 1879. 4 years later, he marries Edith. Edith is a family, kind of a ward of the family. She grew up with Robert and Anne and a few of the other cousins, and so kind of Robert fell into a natural relationship with her later, and they got married, and that's where the children of Robert H. Coleman originate from. But that's the second mansion, and as I already gave away the secret here, some conjecture and a lot of interest in, well, where was that other mansion? How come we've never seen it? We've never seen any architectural drawings for it or any photographic evidence, or other than a few stones in the story that, well, the stones now are part of St. Luke's Episcopal Church. But here's what made it worth putting a little story in Lebtown back in November. Over in Elizabeth, I showed you the Elizabeth Mansion. That's still owned by one of the Colemans, Craig Coleman. And up in the attic there, they've got a bunch of photo albums and other things. And in there is this picture. And handwritten on the back of the picture it says, First Bridal Mansion. And that story got traction for the longest time. People said, yeah, First Bridal Mansion. And there were some, including the Feidigs, that were emphatic, no, couldn't be. Now, what do you think? Does that look like a mansion that would exist in Cornwall? Well, yeah, hard to say. You know, it looks kind of old, it looks kind of interesting. There's two people in there. It looks like, look at the lady on the right lounging in the academic. Yeah, Tom? Ta-da. Yep. That's my story. I looked at that a few times and I said, you know, it looks too finished. And, you know, even if not the mansion, you would expect the grounds around there not to look quite so pristine either. And also the architecture just looked enough different from some of the other stuff that we've been looking at today. So what happened? I had also written a story recently about the Cornwall grist mill down below. You know, you'd follow our mill race down into Wildflower Lane. And as a result of some of that, I got to know this guy over in England. There's the Mills Archive in the UK. And they publish a regular newsletter of all things about grist mills and windmills and things like that. And I had a hunch that this looked like it came from Britain. So I sent him a note, email, and said, by any chance, do you recognize this? I sent him the email like 10 o'clock at night, our time. By the morning time, I get up. He says, well, yeah, it's like 13 miles down the road from us. It's called Arborfield Hall. And it's got quite a history. It goes back to the 1300s. Henry VIII had some connection to this originally. And, well, it does have a Coleman connection, and that was why it was in the family photo album. Just people had forgotten why it was in there. And I put it in that article. I'm forgetting the details, too. But there was a fellow, I think his name was George Osgodby, and one of his offspring married a Coleman, and on the George Dawson Coleman side, or on the James Coleman side. So apparently somebody went over and took a picture at some point and put it in a family album, and generations later they said, this must be the first bridal mansion. So, but all of that to say, history can be kind of fun, you know, the investigating and turning over rocks and looking at what's underneath there and trying to add things together. So, and one of the thoughts that kind of gelled for me while I was thinking about all this stuff is, and it came out in the Robert story and a little bit of the Ann story, is the Coleman connection to houses of worship in this area. And I thought this might be a good way to end, given here we are talking about our own 75th anniversary. Does anyone recognize this one? I can't hear you through the mask, I'm sorry. This is actually Lancaster, St. James Episcopal. This is the church that the original Robert Coleman was one of the pillars of the church going back in the late 1700s. And this is when daughter Margaret was getting involved with Reverend Muhlenberg. Robert Coleman, being a church warden, said, this isn't happening, you know. And they had, well, actually they were fighting about, Muhlenberg wanted to establish Wednesday evening Bible study. And yeah, you know, and why our Robert Coleman didn't favor that, you know, it's just something you didn't do, I guess. But so that was a big problem. Muhlenberg eventually won because Robert dies in 1825, but he didn't get to marry the daughter. So, how about that one? You know that one. This is Cornwall United. It didn't used to be called United Methodist, but the Freemans had a hand in building that, and the what do you say? The manse or the pastor's house. They're attached to it. There you go. That's what Charles. This is St. Luke's Episcopal with the parish house in the front corner. And how about that one? You've driven by that. Yes, I'm getting some noise out of the door here, sorry. He said Christ Presbyterian. It used to be called something else before that, but this is the North Lebanon Colemans. Actually, something that you don't see anymore up there are the, if you kind of see on this side, there are a whole bunch of houses, just like our Miners Village and Bird Coleman Village. They had built workers' houses for the furnace right along there, and they built a church for the workers. Yes, Coleman, this is Route 72 right here, so right up here is the entrance. They didn't call it Route 72 back then. And just another very nice relic, something that survived, for which we're grateful. And this one, wouldn't expect you to recognize this unless you've been to Savannah. This is Christ Church, established 1733, and if you can read the writing on the plaque here, it says, "To the glory of God in the memory of John Wesley." So all the Methodists can stand and salute this if you'd like. It says here, priest of the Church of England, minister to Savannah, 1736 and 37. And I think it says founder of the Sunday school of this church. Quite a bit of history there. And the church is still there. And young Robert and young Ann were there frequently when they were in Savannah. I don't know. I can't speak for the Episcopals either. Good question. He wanted to know if they had Wednesday night Bible study. So this is how I would like to end this before questions. So I've made this message, the sadness that those houses are gone. It reminds us how, we're all but grass, as the scriptures say. But I think to their credit, with the great wealth, the Colemans lived their lives despite, not despite, but in addition to all of the mining and the iron industry and all that they did. What I picked up out of all the correspondence and materials is that they did live their lives believing and serving greater wealth, the kingdom of God. And I think that's something we can take as well. And one other thought there, history. I unloaded a whole bunch of facts, but where I went to school, history was considered an art, not a science. Maybe you can reflect on it. Science is all about collecting data, forming hypotheses, and proving your points, which when we have these history lectures, I'm always hearing little disagreements, but yeah, it had to be this way. No, it had to be that way. And it's just interesting. You could say exactly what year something happened, but where is the art in that? And, art means we attach meaning. We ask a question, not what happened, but why it happened, and what does it mean? So I'd like to leave you with that particular thought. And thank you. I will be back Tuesday evening. I hope to tell the Fighting story, the book that they wanted to read, they wanted to write. And some of my travels recently came across that interesting quote from Truman, which struck me in a special way. So thanks again. And did you have any other questions? Or we, yeah. On 422 going west on Cumberland Street. That was one of the Coleman structures. I thought that he built that, somebody's going to straighten me out, after he originally in St. Luke's had a crypt in the basement of the church where Lily was buried, and later Edith said, part of the getting married, they said, I didn't want to celebrate our marriage vows over Lily's body, And I think he built the memorial chapel after that for that purpose, to house her. Is that right? Oh, yeah. Right. We're talking about the same Robert H. Coleman, but yeah, he had built another furnace out in that side of town, and that was part of, again, they had a commitment to the kingdom business, not just the iron business, and they wanted to provide